Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Carr, and I'm Chief Knowledge Broker for OCTO, Open Communications for the Ocean. And we're very pleased to have all of you with us here today. Um, we have Emily Ogier from the University of Tasmania speaking to us today about novel marine climate interventions, current global status, and how we can govern them responsibly. And we're thrilled to be doing a webinar in this time zone, which is not our normal. We're normally in US Northern Hemisphere working hours, so we're very pleased to be with you here today. Um, so there's Before we get started, I wanted to let everyone know that we're going to how the webinar will run. We'll first have Emily giving her presentation. And then we'll move on to question and answer. And the way we do question and answer for these webinars is that we take in questions through the chat, which is open to everyone to use, and to the Q&A. So if you type your questions in, you can type them in at any point during the webinar. And then for the chat, it's also open to use if you have any additional input or that you want to provide on the topic to Emily or any of the other attendees. Please feel free. We just ask that you keep it on the topic for the use of the chat. And Emily, thank you so much for being here today. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for this opportunity to talk to this wide practitioner group. It's really exciting. So hello, everyone online. I'm joining you from the southern reaches of the globe. It's great to be able to interact with this global forum, and really excited about this opportunity to talk about our research. So I'm going to be focusing on these novel climate interventions and report to you from some empirical and systematic research we've done on their global status, and more particularly focusing on some of the governance gaps and how we can address those. And I wanted to acknowledge I work with two colleagues in particular who've collaborated on this work, along with a much wider research group and research lab, which I'll just move to that slide now. So we all work together on what's called a SNAP working group for governing ocean change, and SNAP is funded under the Science for Nature Partnerships and the TNC. And we've also had some funding from the Australian Research Council to do this work. And so it's a diverse working group comprised of the active researchers, but also practitioners in the field. And you can see that list there. And that's been a fantastic mechanism to understand and explore these dimensions globally. But just briefly on me, I'm a trained marine social scientist. I focus a lot on political economy and human geography. I work in Hobart, the southern part of Australia, at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies, and I'm also a member of the Centre for Marine Socioecology. It's really fantastic to come to you today. In terms of, I mentioned where I'm coming from, so it's very important to us that we acknowledge country. So the lands I'm coming to you from were the lands of the Muwinina people in Tasmania, who were or have been extirpated through colonisation. And so today we acknowledge both the past Muwinina people as the First Nations, but also the contemporary Tasmanian Palawa peoples in Tasmania as they negotiate their way through these conditions. And we particularly offer our respect to elders past and present, and acknowledge First Nation peoples and elders who might be joining us today from many nations around the world. So really, our title has some terms in it that just warrant a bit of explanation. What are novel marine climate interventions? What are we referring to? So the word intervention in fact refers to an intentional action to change a situation with the aim of improving it or preventing it from getting worse, according to the Cambridge Dictionary. So for the purposes of our research, we've defined marine climate interventions as deliberate planned actions in climate impacted marine socio-ecological systems, and they're undertaken to achieve desired outcomes or goals, so they're intentional. And they can be inclusive of mitigation and adaptation. From our original systematic review, we identified quite a range of different types of marine interventions that are being described in the literature. And we found from that literature that not only are there multiple different types, but they're being rapidly tested, deployed, and across multiple different types of ocean environments and ocean systems. And so this really is our starting place, that we've got this phenomena of all these different types of planned intentional actions in marine spaces that have a climate dimension to them. They're novel because we've not seen them deployed historically for these purposes, combining different forms of social and other forms of technologies to achieve a type of goal that is, again, also novel because it's in the context of a climate impacted marine system. So this work, I'll just briefly point you to one of our foundational papers, is presented in the paper by Tiffany Morrison et al. So we have a situation of multiple different types of interventions. That's our starting point for this analysis. But why does governance of all these different types of actions actually matter? Why would we see a need to talk about that and investigate that further? Well, to settle our terms, we refer to governance as processes of rule, steerage and guidance by public and private institutions and actors engaged in ideation, or the coming up of the idea, the funding, the planning, the assessment, the deployment and management, among other aspects of these interventions and the marine socio-ecological systems in which they occur. That means that I would say that most of you online would constitute actors, governance actors, who have some kind of influence, steerage, guidance, potentially formal rule over these interventions that we're describing. So just to put our focus on marine climate interventions in context, and in the context of developments that have happened even since we've published our recent set of papers, we've got one of the initial drivers in this whole space was in fact the release of the 2019 IPCC report, which really identified that some of the preferred outcomes were actually unrealisable without intentional interventions to draw down legacy carbon from the atmosphere. And that really triggered this kind of heat, if you like, or focus on these ocean or marine climate interventions. Just by way of example, the recently released formal national risk assessment, climate risk assessment here in Australia, actually explicitly has started to include the inclusion of interventions as risk mitigation strategies. So we're starting to see this idea of marine climate interventions enter formal policy responses to climate change. We're also starting to see increasing analytical powers to actually attribute the effects of climate emissions on our marine systems. And that's actually going to continue to fuel the need for emitters to actually look to potentially some of these interventions as mechanisms to offset their now the types of climate effects that's actually in evidence resulting from their emissions. So we see that as a real driver for the emitting sector. We've also got other important foundational reports coming out, such as the Global Tipping Points report, which just came out this year. And it highlights that really tipping points have essentially been exceeded for many of our coral reef systems, but that the positive outcomes lie in governance interventions and innovations. And they include the possibility of positive tipping points. They really point to that as being the proactive, positive action arena, if you like, in this area. And similarly, the focus on governance of these interventions is also emerging from the civil society sector, such as Oxfam, highlighting issues of climate colonialism and how they could in fact be perpetuated through some of our interventions if they're not governed responsibly. So there's a lot of focus on this, and the area, the field, is changing rapidly even as we release our findings. So what drove our group to ask, well, what are these phenomena? What are these interventions? Two main observations: that with climate change occurring, the actual window or scope or frame of the types of decisions that we're prepared to make about what we do in our oceans is actually changing. So some have called that or linked that to ideas of a climate emergency framing. But nonetheless, what we seem to be prepared to do in our ocean space has actually shifted as a result of recognising the climate effects on our oceans. And that change in the decision-making scope or governance scope is also being matched by the role of key actors, and that's particularly scientists and ocean funders who are acting as intervention leaders. Most of the interventions that we found described in our systematic literature review were really being led not by public organisations, but by science organisations and ocean funders who are taking the steps to explore and innovate many of the types of actions we'll be talking about today. So we've got this really interesting context in which we have an accelerated rate of the need to do something and an accelerated interest and set of actions by non-typical actors in our ocean spaces. This gives rise to what we've identified and is one of the problems we're investigating with our research, which is the pacing problem, whereby innovation is outpacing what we suspect is outpacing governance preparedness to anticipate and responsibly manage the risks of these types of interventions. So for some of the other insights we gained through our systematic review was that in the published literature, there's just a really wide variety of ways of presenting, describing, identifying risks and benefits about a range of different types of interventions. And noting, of course, the interventions themselves that we've covered are really highly disparate. They range from interventions to draw down legacy carbon through to interventions to reduce carbon emissions, interventions in social and political space, interventions to simply improve the resilience of existing coastal and marine systems. But across the literature and within those types of interventions, the perception about risks and benefits varied substantially. So we don't have consensus amongst the scientific community on these risks. We also found that there isn't a great deal of intervention guidance that's out there. And what is there is really focused on the research and experimental phases and not on these as actions to address the ocean warming effects on our oceans. So our review also took us into more of an in-depth analysis of the different types of risks, and we matched those to the different types of interventions, as I mentioned previously. And we certainly did find a lot of these studies, and on a positive note, we found in a lot of these studies that there was also recognition that these interventions, of course, do present risks, and these studies often cited and referred to some of the strategies for reducing those risks, which we were able to harvest, if you like, for our further analysis. We grouped up the types of risks into a key set of risks, which I'll discuss in a minute, but they largely relate to distrust and negligence, opportunity cost and harm, and ineffectiveness. So on those intervention risks, we argue that those intervention risks actually present major governance challenges, because if these intervention risks are not being responsibly managed, then we have outcomes which really warrant addressing and warrant consideration in the actual design and assessment and support and investment in these different types of interventions. So one of the most obvious risks, of course, is simply just ineffectiveness relative to whatever the stated goal of the intervention is. And that might be a mitigation goal or an adaptation goal. And then another of the intervention risks we identified was harm, the unintended cultural, social or ecological harms that can occur because of the interventions. Particularly given many of them are novel and are untried and untested. That harm dimension is certainly something that for which there can be limited amounts of assessment. Another form of risk we identified was negligence, which is where if an intervention were to be fully deployed or at scale, that we did identify in the literature a lack of provisions to ensure that any further harms, that someone has responsibility for restitution of any further harms. So that being another intervention risk, more related to the governance of the deployment of those risks. Another type of risk was distrust, that if these interventions simply charged ahead and really took no note of public concern or public deliberation. They really actually risked heightening concerns about these types of marine climate interventions that may not even be commensurate with the actual risks that they pose. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, and at a more strategic broad scale level, there's the whole question of opportunity cost, that these intervention risks, if the decision to support them or not doesn't take account of other opportunities that are presented, other choices that are available, other ways to invest that funding, other actions to take, they could actually come at a really high opportunity cost, that some of these interventions could in fact crowd out other more effective interventions. And this, of course, operates, as I mentioned, at a bit of a broader scale. So we really found that these intervention risks, they don't fit within a recognisable risk assessment framework because they're really operating across so many different policy domains. For example, oceans policy, economic development policy, social justice policy, conservation policy, climate policy. And the fact that they all coexist in relation to a single intervention, I think also highlights some of points towards the governance challenges that we go on to investigate. Some of the other challenges we identified through the review of literature was that the existing rules that do exist in our governance systems to manage small-scale risk in exploratory and research and developmental phases are really not fit for upscaling of these interventions, so there's work to do there. Similarly, that the kind of rules crafted to govern interventions that have historically taken place, which were not occurring in the context of climate-affected oceans, just may not be fit for the kind of dynamic, rapidly changing ocean conditions that we're facing now. We also found in our review that few maritime nations actually have strategic policy capacity at the moment to fully anticipate and respond to these dynamics. And the final conclusion from the review component was that effective governance is much easier to achieve if risks and benefits are much more explicitly understood than currently. So finally, that point sounded fairly negative, but really we asked in our SNAP working group, is it possible to in fact harness the optimism that we can observe in the proliferation of these different types of interventions to govern risks and bring about responsible transformation for climate impacted oceans? So the challenge to us is not to quell the drivers behind the proliferation of interventions, but potentially to redirect some of this optimism toward these responsible governance dimensions. So what kind of investigation did we do? I've already mentioned the review of literature that we undertook. We also used some expert elicitation, and we ran an online global survey, and we ran some key informant interviews. In terms of our survey, our online survey, we used this in simply just an open exploratory sense to find out what's happening, where's it happening, who's leading it, who are the key actors involved, what kind of scientific assessment is going on in the consideration of these interventions, what stage of development are they at, what types of broader governance conditions exist for that intervention were it to be deployed at scale. What kinds of concerns and interests do practitioners in the field have? What risks and benefits and missed opportunities do they perceive? They were the nature of our types of questions. So we got a great result for this survey. We 332 responses across the globe. And in terms of the distribution of those responses, we had 18% were from non-English language responses. We wanted to make sure we were attending to questions of that were relevant in the global majority. We also had a mix of different types of actors responding to our survey too, and that's a result of our targeting of professional communities, policy communities, practitioner communities, as well as scientific communities who are active in this area. Right, so part of our analysis too, and the way we actually examined the data that was in this survey, was we actually adopted and adapted a responsible research framework that was produced by Stiglo et al., where they identified these key attributes of what responsible research in a general sense would look like in an innovation arena. And they were anticipation, inclusion, responsiveness, and reflexivity. So to actually pursue our analysis, we asked ourselves, well, how would they apply specifically to marine climate interventions? And in the case of this particular framework, I'm showing you that we actually applied that even more specifically to socially responsible governance of these interventions. So these four concepts gave us our kind of normative guide, or our a structure to ask, what are we looking for in how these interventions are currently being governed? And this also led to our more technical research question as we examined the results of that survey, which was, are indicative governance arrangements, so governance arrangements that are indicative of these four responsible governance attributes, are they in place for currently active or planned marine climate interventions? So in terms of results, now these results are more from our empirical work through the survey and the interviews. We wanted to find out what is the current status of marine climate interventions. So first of all, we actually just simply asked about awareness. And we found that the kinds of broad type of interventions for which there's the highest degree of awareness were those we grouped as coastal and marine restoration interventions. So they are in situ, they are focused on specific marine environments, and they are very much about having proximate positive effects on those systems. There's really high awareness of those different types of interventions. The second group where there's quite a lot of awareness was a related type of intervention, which we labelled marine bioengineering. So that's taking a kind of a restorative approach, but also introducing other types of bioengineering technologies to do that. So actions such as artificial habitat manipulation, assisted evolution of marine species, assisted migration, etc. That had the second level highest levels of awareness. Marine geoengineering, which is another group term that we use to describe essentially actions that are trying to largely remove legacy carbon. That had some level of awareness, particularly those to do with actual solar radiation, but much lower levels of awareness of some of the techniques known as MCDR. And then again, very low awareness of another grouping we identified, which is marine social institutional capacity building interventions. So there was quite a lot of detail about these interventions provided in our survey, but low awareness, although we actually think that is also that we didn't prompt for those types of interventions. But they are the types of interventions that are doing new and novel things with people in communities and with institutions. In terms of where they're occurring, they're actually really quite distributed globally, and we found most types of interventions in all the major ocean marine regions in our survey. We didn't find a really strong spatial pattern other than simply diversity, or that multiple types of interventions were occurring in multiple locations. But that in itself presents an interesting situation. Is there ever a risk of different types of interventions co-occurring within the same locations if they're being driven or authorised or funded through disparate groups for which there's no planning coordination? We saw that as a potential governance challenge. But equally, it also could be a strategy for resilience by having a diversified set of different types of interventions within specific regions. You're really welcome to look at the details of this analysis in these papers. We did find some fairly different results in terms of the range of levels of technical readiness and intervention deployment. So this result is very much matched to the result around awareness, that those types of interventions for which there's much more awareness, there also seem to be much higher levels of more advanced levels of implementation. They'd moved from concept or pilot into actually full-scale implementation in the relevant marine regions. And again, those interventions where there was lower awareness, we similarly found reported lower levels of deployment and technical readiness. So a somewhat unsurprising result. So in doing that, in establishing simply what is the status, which is that we do have multiple different types of interventions co-occurring across our ocean spaces at different levels of deployment and readiness, we asked ourselves, well, what are the governance challenges that we therefore need to address? So one of the results that particularly came through from this analysis when we asked practitioners what was the goal of their intervention was a really mixed result in terms of the type of climate goal that they identified linked to their intervention. So essentially what we found here is that practitioners are undertaking the same broad type of intervention. In fact, within that broad type of intervention, attributed or identified quite a surprising array of different types of climate goals attached to that intervention. So we have low consensus in terms of what these different types of interventions are trying to achieve. So we also found what our group considered sometimes a low level of coherence as well, where there would be a kind of an attribution of a type of climate goal, such as climate mitigation or carbon emission reduction, attached to, for example, a restorative activity. So we also suspect that this result is in fact indicating what we call goal ambiguity, that amongst these practitioner communities, it's such an emergent space that there sometimes can be quite a lack of clarity about what these types of interventions are trying to achieve. So we also found too that multiple interventions actually identified both climate adaptation and mitigation as concurrent goals of the same type of intervention. Another key result that we found when we applied that responsible research and innovation framework and adapted it for our purposes, we found that with fairly low levels of observed occurrence or indication of responsible governance arrangements. So those where we saw greater levels of presence were those concerned with ineffectiveness and the assessment of whether or not this intervention is going to work according to the technical definition of whatever that is in the context of the intervention. Where we found less presence of the types of indicative responsible governance arrangements were in those concerned more with the social dimensions around harm, distrust, negligence, and then these more strategic concerns around opportunity cost. So these results are also organised by the broad types as well. And there are, as you can see, sort of a mixed result across those different types of interventions, which also possibly indicates the level of deployment and technical readiness. But our main conclusion from this result is that we did find evidence that the pacing problem is present, that we seem to have gaps in the presence of the types of responsible governance interventions which we would expect to see if we felt these risks were being sufficiently addressed through the governance arrangements present for the types of interventions. More broadly, there's a set of wider governance challenges that our analysis has really highlighted that relates as much to the drivers behind the proliferation of the different types of interventions we're seeing. And so what we're finding links to many of the points I've just made previously in terms of the governance challenges, that we're having this really fast-paced, perhaps under-planned development of novel marine climate interventions, which exacerbates the risk of cumulative harms, of ethical dilemmas and unrealised co-benefits, and potentially eroded rights where there is insufficient trust and attendance to harm and negligence questions with the local communities who have rights in those marine areas. And that can in fact have a fairly negative effect on climate policies if we're not really thinking clearly about some of these opportunity costs that arise from these sort of undergoverned marine climate interventions. And then the net result of all that is essentially limited climate benefits, that we've got a missed opportunity that's not being fully realised. That's the negative view, or the pessimistic view. On the flip side, our results also did identify evidence of some fully responsible marine climate intervention deployment that was taking account of many of these social and institutional factors as well. And that we feel these are real shining light examples where there's evident planning, there's evident attendance to moral and ethical dimensions, there's evident attendance to rights and co-benefits. And in fact, there's active engagement with public deliberation in these types of interventions. And then these, of course, have a positive effect on climate policy integrity, and the net effect we theorise is strengthened climate benefits. So taking the results of our analysis, particularly that we do have some governance gaps to address, what can be done about that? Because if you remember, our broadest goal is to harness the optimism in these interventions and direct them so that the types of interventions we continue to undertake are responsible and transformative. So we've tried to link up these kind of intervention risks with the challenges I mentioned to a set of principles, which if we could start to integrate these more into the way that planning and assessment and that broader active governance of these interventions, if those principles are embedded, we start to see more realisation of the types of climate goals that are broadly being pursued. And those governance principles include, let's start at the bottom, activating policy integrity, which is where we understand that an intervention in a marine area, while it, for permitting purposes, may only have to be assessed according to certain regulatory requirements relating to, let's say, local environmental controls, but in fact has an implication for climate policy or for social justice policy in the same region. So that's that concept of activating policy integrity, that we recognise that these interventions aren't only acting on one policy frontier. Another governance principle is that critical publics are not necessarily wanting to lead to the cessation of marine climate interventions, but may actually have really constructive critique to offer, and can be marshalled toward designing more responsible marine climate interventions. There's also a great opportunity in the way many of these interventions are being undertaken to enable rights-based co-benefits. So we're seeing that for those interventions which are following some of the high-level principles, for example, in blue carbon interventions, that they can actually materially produce co-benefits for local peoples. It's also important to always bring these interventions back to the shared moral goals, and they do include limiting harm and safeguards around harm at the same time as attending to this broader challenge of climate mitigation. They're also the governance principle that really came out to us through our results too, is that these interventions are not necessarily happening within strong planning frameworks, and that those planning frameworks though themselves need to also recognise the state of these marine social ecological systems and where they're tracking, and that planning needs to be attendant to those, or anticipatory of those futures. And then ultimately, we think following these governance principles, we actually start to see strengthened climate benefits in all their types of forms, including both mitigation and adaptation. But making this a bit more practical, how can policy makers and planners contribute to responsible marine climate intervention? Well, our research identified some actual questions that policymakers and decision makers could ask themselves in attending to those governance principles that we identified. So what are the best methods for understanding and communicating the consequences of intervening, for example? In terms of planning, how can we improve this spatial planning and cumulative impact assessment and actually incorporate them into how we assess specific interventions? Can we facilitate or develop and facilitate bioethical frameworks for understanding some of the genomics work that's going on in terms of some of our interventions? How can we design interventions from the start that actually strengthen sovereignty and tenure and intellectual property and rights for Indigenous peoples, for example? There really are lots of actions, lots of guidance out there to bring into play some of these governance principles, which I'm about to highlight. So one of the actions we've undertaken and identified is that policymakers probably just need some support in intervention literacy, and to do that, to be able to compare different types of intervention options and therefore have the ability to consider opportunity cost. What are the options? What could they else be doing? What opportunities could be foregone? So as part of the SNAP initiative, we've developed a guide to marine climate interventions that just gives a very high level pointers to different types of interventions and to some of the resources that exist for them, including some really strong work on codes of practice for research into these different types of interventions. We've also developed a policy brief that puts into plain language some of these key principles that we're talking about. We've also asked ourselves, particularly for practitioners and researchers, not only policy and decision makers, what could their actions be? And we really feel that the role of researchers and practitioners as de facto governors, which is the point I was making earlier, that they're the active agents in this area who are developing these intervention possibilities and bringing them about. In fact, there's a really exciting opportunity here for that community to expand to include human dimensions, social researchers and governance dimensions, and to in fact expand the scope of scientific assessment that's going on around these interventions to really enable some of these socially responsible governance principles to actually be implemented. So rather than see these groups, or see the practitioner community, or to see the opportunity essentially, and to harness the optimism in the practitioner community, which we found in our surveys extremely high willingness to do so, and which was really positive. And finally, funders. We feel like they're a really important group in this area, and we've asked ourselves, how can they contribute to responsible marine intervention? So we've developed a funders brief, and the link's here, and that goes through, will synthesize many of the points that we've already made. But there are really important actions that funders take in how they empower the ideation and the governance and the steerage of types of interventions. And we feel like they're actually a group with a lot of capacity to move a lot faster than our regulatory and planning agencies, and have a lot of really positive influence in this area. So we've directed this resource particularly at them, which synthesises a lot of our findings and makes suggestions for, both to increase their literacy of the range of different types of interventions, but also to highlight how they could, in fact, pursue some pathways for responsible investment in marine climate intervention. So finally, I thought I'd challenge myself to summarise just in 3 very brief points our conclusions about the governance we need. And the first one was, I think, it to be intentional. So we highlighted that climate goal ambiguity. We feel that some intentional clarification around what these types of interventions are trying to achieve and for whom would be a great step for those of you who are practitioners out there. I feel like recognition of the polycentric nature of what we're talking about is really important, that these interventions are not only, for example, to achieve a conservation goal or preserve a conservation value, they've got, or to achieve a climate goal. They've got all of these dimensions in them, ocean, climate and people, all bound up in one, both in policy senses and in terms of their potential effects. And finally, we think that through those 2 principles, we can be in fact intentional about being responsible, but also transformative, because as we're seeing, and the Global Tipping Points report points out, we're really at a point where it's time to consider the transformative possibilities given the degree of changing ocean that we're confronting. So thanks for listening to me. Hopefully the resources are useful and you've got the links, and I look forward to any conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. These are fantastic resources that the working group has prepared, and so it's exciting to see them. And just to clarify, you have created the codes of practice for the various interventions? Those are available?
No,
No. Okay. Or it's
thanks, Sarah. They exist, and other specialist groups have prepared them in relation to
okay.
specific interventions.
Okay, but they're all available. Okay, fantastic. We do have some questions, so we'll go ahead and address those questions and then see where we end up with time. But thank you everyone for being here. And if you do have questions for Emily, you can put them in the chat or in the Q&A. Okay, so the first question that came in, what do rights-based co-benefits look like for marine interventions? Can you give an example?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it can be one of those terms. So one example would be that if an intervention, let's say blue carbon intervention, was looking to use some actions in a local community area or coastal area that was going to result in the capturing and storage of some carbon, and that carbon would actually have a monetary value, then right from the outset, a very primary question is, well, whose marine area is this? What is the tenure status of this area? And it can be difficult because that legal tenure status might not be very clear. But in many regions where there are blue carbon opportunities from a biophysical perspective, there often are under forms of community tenure where local communities have some kind of either legal or LORE law rights and interests in those locations. And if you were to design from the outset for these co-benefits, then that would be, and rights, that would be to instill in your design principles for your intervention that in fact that community has tenure over that site, that they give permission and in fact partners in some kind of blue carbon initiative, and that in fact the monetary benefits from any sale of any carbon credits, for example, are in the first instance owned and held by those communities. And so that's about centering and situating the cultural authority for the action with the actual tenure rights holders in that location, but also the flow of benefits to those same rights holders. But I think it's a really important question because it isn't always very clear whose rights and under what systems of law or laws those rights are held. There is a fantastic facility called the Turning Tide Facility, which is globally doing some work on these questions and has resources, I think, to help navigate what marine tenure is, how you know it was present, how to find out, and how to approach the holders of marine tenure in different coastal and marine areas.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another great resource. Okay, we'll move on to the next question. Thanks, Emily. Great presentation. There's an axis of technology readiness that is relevant to these novel solutions. Was this part of discussion of what is appropriate governance for different TRL levels?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's been some excellent analysis of those matters already by Gattuso et al., I think, that have asked about technical readiness of subsets of these different types of interventions. We didn't examine that specifically because our focus was governance, but I actually think that would be an excellent next step because at each of those levels of technical readiness and according to that framework, there are different technical governance matters that need to be taken into account. And there's quite a lot of work and literature in that. I understand those kinds of concepts have very much been taken into account in developing the codes of practice for example, the marine carbon dioxide removal technologies. They have looked at those frameworks and adopted them. So I think my point would be, I don't know that would be a very useful exercise at the really broad level across all these different types of technologies. It's quite specific to the technology, but I couldn't agree more that it's a good analytical tool to understand what types of governance is needed given the relative level of technical readiness of the type of intervention. So great next piece of research for somebody.
Okay, great. All right, thank you, Emily. Another question that came in, how does the new agreement on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, BBNJ, relate to this work, particularly regarding area-based management tools?
Again, an excellent question. I don't have a lot of in-depth knowledge about that framework. I guess the question would be what obligations or responsibilities does it place on estate managers under the BBNJ for the signatories of the BBNJ, and whether they in fact instill some principles that probably align to some of the principles that we've been talking about, a call to action to or a requirement to consider some of these dimensions that we've referred to. It is an interesting question though, because area-based management and spatial management can also be in some ways it's part of that. It's also part of that kind of static approach to which in some ways can be in conflict with the rapidly changing ocean conditions that we're experiencing and the mobility that we're observing in a lot of species and a lot of community conditions. So I think I'd defer to others who know that agreement much more to understand that. But I would imagine that the agreement itself introduces sets of legal and governance obligations that would need to be taken into account.
Thank you, Emily. And another question, it says governance challenges, distrust interventions. How do you overcome when funders and sovereign states, where interventions are supposed to occur, are not trusting each other?
That's a great question, and it's certainly again across the interventions. There's quite a different array of large global actors and intergovernmental organisations interacting with domestic local actors, and I think that is part of the new environment, and I think that's part of what's novel about the context that we're in. The fact that we have these very influential, very important global funding organisations, for example. And I think that is, I would almost treat that as a red flag that trust is going to be hard to build from that point. It probably reflects the lack of strong or evident governance principles that either can point to participate in some improved understanding of what they would trust in each other. One of the critiques that came up, actually it was in our survey responses, was from our practitioners, was the tension between the availability of funding from large global funders for some of these interventions and the recognition or concern about the motivation of some of the funders, particularly those not in the philanthropic space, but those in the venture capital or investment space, where it's felt that to get more intervention happening, the business case for them needs to be evident, and that's through carbon markets, for example, or other types of nature markets, nature repair markets, and that introduced automatically for some of the practitioner community who responded to our survey a moral and ethical dilemma that was quite difficult to navigate. But I'm not sure. I think that's perhaps more reflects a relationship between the local actors at a site where the intervention might be happening and the global funders. I'm not sure how that speaks to that question about national or state level management agencies and distrust. But I suspect that we're going to have to deal with that level of distrust when there are financial incentives involved for some of the interventions. That's a probably inevitable dimension. And again, all I can point to by way of solution is that it's the distrust builds in an undergoverned arena. So where there is nothing to point to in terms of globally agreed standards for how to go about these interventions, then there's really very few platforms on which to meet and have constructive interaction about matters of trust or mistrust or distrust.
Right. All right. Thank you, Emily. That's all the questions we have right now. If anybody has any, when you get them in the next few seconds, we'll go ahead and wrap up a few minutes early. But this is, I mean, such an interesting area. It'll be such a growth area for in the future. And so it's great that the SNAP group is taking a look at this. Okay. And actually, we do have a question, so we'll go ahead. Given the polycentric nature of marine intervention governments, do you see a role for some kind of centralized body, whether led by civil society, private sector, or governments, that can aid in coordinating responsible, coordinated global governance, or better served by a patchwork? What body comes closest to filling that governance gap today?
Right. I don't know that I don't think there is a body that comes close currently. I mean, in terms of institutions that exist, probably the one with the most influence would be MARPOL, or the International Convention, the London Protocol, sorry, which has a great bearing on what can be added to the ocean. I'm kind of limiting the scope of this answer more to those interventions which have really obvious global dimensions to them, because they're attempting to achieve climate mitigation through things such as ocean alkalinity enhancement, for example, or solar radiation management, etc., which might be deployed locally, but the way they interact with the ocean and climate system is in fact a global matter. And so I think, yeah, that's really the main institutional set of rules that I'm aware of that have a governing role currently? Yes, my answer would be I would think that while we need that polycentricism in how we govern, given this is relating to a global climate system, an ocean system, it would make sense to have some kind of global or oceans level oversight over the planning of these different types of interventions. And it might even achieve harm reduction if experimental information can be shared, if efficacy information can be shared and coordinated, for example. But whether that's a soft power or a hard power, I think it's probably more a case of some kind of global entity that is available for information sharing and voluntary coordination and cooperation, and standard setting, maybe what is called for here. Many of the other actions are quite localized, and it would be the way they'd interact with local level governance would be quite complex, I think. So it may not be a matter for global governance. I'm thinking of kind of restorative actions in situ. So I think to your point, Sarah, this discussion is quite high level, and we've grouped up a lot of very disparate types of interventions, and a lot of this governance work is going to need to happen in some instances in more of those specific intervention areas, but at the same time they're still the same ocean, if you like. And so from an oceans governance perspective, we do also need to keep that broader strategic oversight over the mix and array of different types of interventions.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Emily. This is great. And as I was starting to say, it's going to be such an important area for the future. So it's great that the SNAP group is taking a look at this and thinking about this. And we've posted lots of great resources in the chat, which hopefully people have gotten. And we'll wrap up. Thank you again for being present today and sharing this work with us. And thank you to Greta for putting us in touch.
Lovely. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. All right. Goodbye, everyone. Hope to see you in future webinars. We'll have a few more in this appropriate time zones in the coming months. Okay. All right. Bye, everyone.